The thing I find the most fascinating in the work that we do is that people might put diversity and inclusion into a HR bucket of a learning program, but actually it's about the way that society's changing, it's the way the economy's changing, it's the way the money's being made, it's what people care about, the way work gets done, but it's pigeonholed all too often.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Asad Dhunna, founder and CEO of The Unmistakables, a diversity and inclusion consultancy who are developers of inside-out inclusion, an evidence-based approach to DEI. A lot's changed since Asad and I last spoke in 2002. The Unmistakables have continued to push the boundaries of what it means to build inclusive organizations from the inside out, not just in appearance, but in culture, leadership, and lived experience. They've won multiple awards for the work they're doing, including Asad himself being named as one of campaign's top 10 trailblazers of 2024. Some might argue that the world of DEI has changed too, that we're seeing a shift in priorities, perhaps even a backlash. I'm hoping we can hear a more optimistic view from Asad, along with perhaps some thoughts for anyone who might feel their own organization has lost momentum or focus. Asad, welcome back to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you for having me, Belden. It's nice to be here.
No, it's really great to have you back. Just to kind of set the scene and maybe just remind anybody who didn't listen to the episode a few years back or hasn't caught up with The Unmistakables, maybe you could just say a little bit about it and, sort of what you're doing, how it got started, where it is now.
Yeah, sure. So we work with our clients to unlock growth and we help them stay relevant through inclusion. And where we started was, I guess, questions that I was asked in 2018 about how do we reach different people, how do we grow our businesses, how do we do that through difference? And that was coming through the customer lens. I came from the world of marketing, and then it also came through the colleague and leadership lens of how do we have different perspectives around the table, how do we make sure we're nurturing a more diverse leadership team. So I started the business, and then 2020 you saw what happened around COVID, what happened with George Floyd's murder, the reassessment, and then I guess the advent of the acronym DEI as it's entered our social amygdala. And then when we spoke in 2022, we were sat, I think, in the height of it, where many people felt like DEI could be the solve to so many ills. But then at the same time, as with anything, you had the shadow side of it appear, where people felt left out or like it wasn't for them or it meant something that it isn't. Things have changed. And if you map this against the Gartner hype cycle, we've entered the trough of disillusionment around DEI. And I think we're slowly starting to see what an enlightenment could be. But we're in a really tricky time since we last spoke.
You fairly recently produced a report called Diversity and Confusion that dives into how people in Britain feel about it all. What surprised you in there? What do you think it means for business leaders?
So Diversity and Confusion, we publish that every couple of years. The last one we did was 2023. And then this year we were looking at how the world looks today. And we actually coined a term, the grow up. There's a sense of DEI is growing up. It's growing up because it's being attacked more, and it therefore needs more teeth. But also the people who it's affected by need to see some change. So we cut through some of the headlines because every day we're monitoring what people say about DEI. We look at how the media covers it. And we asked over 2,000 people in the UK how they felt about DEI. Do you think the companies that are prioritising it will succeed or grow more than the ones that are deprioritising it? And interestingly, we found that 55% of the British public agreed that companies that are prioritising DEI are more likely to see them grow and succeed than those deprioritising it. So higher than what we are led to believe through the media. And then when you skew it by different ethnicities, you find Asian, mixed race, black folks have higher percentages between 62% to 81%. And then the average really sits higher for those who are 16 to 44. So you're seeing that there is a younger group of people, there is a more ethnically diverse group of people who are saying actually DEI is a good thing for business. What we then started to look at was, are people positively or negatively affected by DEI in the workplace? What we found was 46% have been positively influenced or impacted by any kind of DEI initiatives in their workplace, but actually 37% said neither positive nor negative, which opens up a question of, are these interventions actually having any impact? Are they creating a change, or are people just a bit indifferent to it? And my hypothesis is, where people are slightly indifferent, it becomes easier for naysayers or negative speak to come in and say these are bad things. So we weren't wholly surprised by it, because when we're in closed rooms with our clients talking to us about what matters to them, they're saying we think this is an important thing, but the political landscape has made things a lot more challenging. And for some people who were naysayers, it's given them legitimacy to pull back.
But there must be like a over 55 white bucket in there that's really counter to all those somewhat encouraging numbers. Is it as bad as I might fear?
I haven't got that exact data in front of me, but there was 40% of people who are 55 plus said that companies are more likely to grow and succeed, versus 55%, which is the average. So there does appear to be an older cohort of people who say, don't know if this is necessary, don't know if we need this.
That's really interesting. Sorry, I have to say, I'm in that demographic myself.
What do you make of it, Belden? Because you must be in rooms that I'm not in, and you hear what people are saying about these sorts of things.
The number one thing I hear people say, quite frankly, and I don't necessarily agree with them, but they sort of say it, is, oh, well, it's all gone a bit too far.
Yeah.
I'm sure that people either know of, or perhaps more likely think they know of, something they read in the press. You do kind of go, well, maybe that really wasn't quite what we were aiming for here.
Yeah, I think everything is a swing. And so the thing about has it gone too far also is linked to the good old days.
Yes.
Where there was more money in the economy.
Yeah, yeah.
And what people don't always attach DEI to is the level of income inequality that exists right now, and the fact that there is less money in the system. And so where that's then going to, what younger people are then striving towards, the macro environment impacts the micro environment. And if people are linking that, they're just saying, well, socially, in our social commentary, things have gone too far. So to give you an example, I was at a conference last week. We were talking about the internet. We were saying, we all had to share a modem, and only one person on a bank of 4 people could go online. And, in the office, you would have loads of fun together. But now we've got more tech. And there's this notion of the good old days. And so I listened to that. And then it was also linked to, well, you can't say what you really think anymore. And the two things are intrinsically connected, because people can say what they think. They do indeed say what they think online all the time. But it's become, we don't converse with each other. We don't debate with each other. We don't discuss with each other. And so some of the bigger social forces or technological forces are then all being lumped into DEI, or this notion of being woke. And that's the thing I find the most fascinating in the work that we do, is that people might put diversity and inclusion into a HR bucket of a learning program, but actually it's about the way that society is changing, it's the way the economy is changing, it's the way the money's being made, it's what people care about, the way work gets done, but it's pigeonholed all too often.
Also, that comment about it's gone too far, I actually dislike.
Right.
Because it feels to me like, well, sort of one or two things are going on. One is people are saying, things have happened that left me feeling a little uncomfortable. So things have gone too far. This is all supposed to happen without it affecting me.
Yeah.
Or they really are against some of it, but they don't want to be the person who thinks that. So they don't want to be the person who says that.
I hear what you're saying. I think the interesting thing, what we're finding around something like diversity, equity, and inclusion, is people don't know what it is or what it isn't. So it becomes a bogeyman.
Yeah.
So when you follow the political argumentation for it, it's, this is a massive waste of money, it's a waste of public funds.
Yeah, yeah.
But you go deeper and you say, this is about protecting against discrimination. It's about reaching more service users. It's about having a more applicable set of products and services that work for different people.
Absolutely.
And what surprises me always is the fact that DEI is often linked to race because of the way that the social discourse has moved on. But when you then start to talk about socioeconomics or class or disability or sexuality, other areas, there's a different level of ease. How do you make the built environment more adaptable as people age, for example, as people have disabilities, as people are living longer? These are all important questions that we are grappling with.
This phrase you used before, I think it was, the grow up. I do think that it's likely, it's possible, because it's sort of true of most human endeavors, that good people who are trying to do the right thing maybe went at it in a way that wasn't as wise as it could have been, or stuff happens, right? And I don't think I've seen anybody do what you did a few minutes ago in the conversation, which is map this against the Gartner curve. I think it's a brilliant way of looking at it.
In our business, we use a lot of tools and frameworks. This is why we built out the model, because when we talk to people, they say, well, I don't know where this sits and fits, and do I belong in it? So what we try to work with them on is to say, right, one of the things that we can impact is the way that you influence and interact as a company with each other, with your public. So in the world of AI, for example, you see that when CEOs are trying to change the way they're influencing and interacting, and they want to move to more agentic AI models, and they want to move to like what Duolingo said, you saw the whiplash because people aren't ready for that to be their way of influencing. So we try and do it because it makes it a bit more accessible versus here's my lived experience and I need you to believe this thing.
I know you've talked about building a strategy, kind of the need for constant reassessment. I'm just curious, has the strategic direction for The Unmistakables shifted, and if so, how?
It has. We went through a period of growth, I think, because a lot of that was fueled by client demand. And then what we started to realize as time was going on was, how do we do fewer clients but bigger and better? It was brilliant because it got us so exposed to many different industries, different approaches. But actually what we found more commonly is clients want someone to hold their hand and work with them through this on an ongoing basis. A lot of them say things like, we know we could do this ourselves, but we need an expert partner who's external to us. So the strategy's changing insofar as we want to do fewer, bigger, better types of work. With the businesses that really care about this, I think you have a lot of people who, in that hype of 2022, were just chucking money at this, and then you see what sticks, and then what matters.
In those larger, bigger engagements, do you see any commonalities in the clients beyond the fact that they're bigger and they're serious?
You do. You see the complexity of it. So you see that what you're bringing on board is different people with different perspectives. So that's your first point of complexity. Then you've got the subject matter is complex because it's about humans and the change in human dynamics. And then you've got the future thinking that's complex as well. So lots of this is, I mentioned earlier, to stay relevant. So if you are a legacy organization, how do you stay relevant to the changing demographics of a city or a country? If you're a growing organization, how do you stay relevant as the growth hits you, and therefore the people who were with you at the beginning are still with you if you want them there? The complexity is what we see. It makes the kind of one and done and out of the box approach challenging. Many training providers do, because that's what they'll try and get to for scale. But what we found is then those interventions don't always work, and they need to be a bit more wrapped around the client. So I've noticed that complexity just demands a bit of bespokeness around it.
There's some risk that inclusion, as an activity, as a way of being even, becomes something that only reasonably profitable, pretty big, well-resourced organizations can afford to do. If you're smaller, you just don't have the scale to make it work. Is that a legitimate concern? If so, what can smaller organizations do?
It is. So I think we just have to slow it down and say, what do we define by inclusion? How do we define that? So if you're saying, well, you want the power of difference around the table and you feel like people can do really well here, that can come from a small company. Often it's very driven by the leader, who might be themselves different, and therefore they want to imbue it early on. Now, the path to growth for early stage companies arguably is easier if you're exclusive, because you can rely more on your system one levels of thinking, hire the people you know, the people you've worked with before, borrow from cultural models from previous companies. That can lead you to growth. But then you hit a scale where to get to the next bit, you do need to bring the difference in. So that, I think, is where there is a reserve of you need profit to invest in it. But I think if you're a smaller company, it can be people led, and it can be led by a smaller group that say, we've either got the experience or this is really important to us. But I would argue that then to get the right systems, policies, processes in is harder. Let me give you an example just to make that real. So if you are building a business and you have people in it, and you might not be at the scale where you want a HR and people team, you will rely potentially on AI or generated contracts. You might rely on policies. Those policies will be designed often. If you took a parental policy, they'll be designed for a male father or someone who was assigned male at birth, and then you will have someone who's assigned female at birth and a female mother. But how does that then work in a same-sex couple? That might be someone in your workforce. How does that work for a single parent? The different designs for family change. How does that work for someone in a couple where they might have lost their partner at some point? All these things are then templatized and they roll out, and they're not always designed for the human condition and the human need. So that's where you have to then go, well, if you're a leader who's invested in this, then you find the way through. But it's not as simple as having the same amount of resources as a large company.
I suspect a lot of people are turning to AI to come up with employment contracts and all sorts of things. One hopes, I hope anyway, that in the beginning, and I think on AI we're still in the beginning, that those sorts of problems happen. But reasonably soon, one hopes that if you look for that employment contract, what you're going to get back is something that says, well, in this case, that, as if it were one thing. But
it depends on what's feeding it and what it's learning. So we're working with a couple of clients at the moment about their responsible approach to AI and how they can make sure what they're feeding it is more diverse. So particularly in image development in the marketing sphere, there is a big push in marketing to have AI do more of the development and do more of the creative work. But if what's feeding it is not representative or truly diverse, then what it will spit out is that. So yeah, I'm with you, Belden, that one would hope the learning model gets better over time.
Asad, I'm looking for some positivity. I may be making it up, but I'm looking for
Looking for hope.
One could imagine that part of that's in the user's learning. That you don't just say, can I have an employment contract? You go, and it needs to cover these situations. Think through the demographics of...
Yeah. What you're describing, Belden, is exactly what one of our consultants, Selena, talks about, which is the difference between the individual and the system. So this is how it works in the culture of any organization. The individual has to have the agency, aptitude, attitude, appetite to want to change the system, and the system has to have the malleability to flex with it. And so if the individual can learn to prompt better, then that will happen. If the individual is under stress or they don't care about it, then it will fall down.
Those two, under stress or don't care, I think is a great explainer of many things that don't work the way we'd all hope.
Yeah, that's the state of the world right now. Everyone just seems to be under stress and flitting between caring and not caring.
Yeah. One of the things I know is that as a smaller firm, you've had to find ways to create impact well out of proportion to your size. And from my experience and observation, you've been doing that. But what, if anything, is generalizable about that? Are there some things you've learned? Because I suspect there are lots of people who are trying to do good things thinking, oh, if we were only 10 times bigger, but we're not yet.
Yeah. When I think about the impact we have, I think it comes from what we set out to do. We talk a lot about accelerating inclusion, and actually in the last 12 months, it has felt like global forces have pulled that back, and it's not something that we want. So talking about the vision, the mission, what that means for us has been really important, as has talking about our values. So one of our values is integrity. So when we're thinking or approached for work, we're getting better at sniffing out what is genuine, what is not, what is to tick a box. There have been clients that I've turned down that have then turned around 6 months later to be the most fruitful. They've had a bit of a pushback from us. I think the other thing about having an impact, and I would say as smaller businesses, it is amazing what you can do with very few resources. And there is a lot of wastage in the corporate world. And it's one of the things I find the most challenging, because I just don't think it needs to be that way. I think you can just look at some of the wastage that sits out there and go, how can I avoid that? What don't we need? What do we need? What's a core essential? One of my first clients, Belden, was actually an architecture practice. They were building a co-working space. We talked about first principles as an architectural practice. If you strip everything back to first principles, what do you actually need? So it used to be, if you ran a consulting or agency type business, you'd need a nice office, you'd want to entertain your clients. First principles today dictate you probably don't need that because of the way that we're working. So stripping it back and going, what do we actually need, has been a way to generate impact.
We've talked about saying no. You've just mentioned clients, but how do you actually say no? What's the conversation with them like? Because it sounds like if I could put it this way, it sounds like you're almost trying to give them a moment of choice.
There is a bit of that. This is more so early on, Belden, I would say. We had clients that would want us to tick a box or give a rubber stamp to say, well, if we think it's okay, then it's okay. And my favourite thing to do is just to wonder, why are they asking the question? So if you think there's a problem here, there probably is. So why are you coming to us? Are you coming to us because you genuinely want to fix it, or because you just need to get out the door? So that has become easier over time. It's not always easy to say no. It's sometimes, you're running a business, you need to take what is at the door at a given moment. But I think it comes back to that value of integrity, where if we live by that, then we think it will play out well for us.
What advice might you give to other purpose-driven leaders, if they want to make real change in their own organization, particularly, for-profit business leaders, in the face of this kind of growing polarity in the whole conversation?
I'm strapped for advice at the moment, Belden, because I think I would be lying to say if it's easy. It's tough at the moment. I think there's a lot of soul searching, head scratching. The founders and CEOs I'm talking to are saying these are tough times. And I think it just comes back to availability of money. It's a harder time to be running a business because money is harder to come by. I would just say something someone once said to me was, the best way to work out if you believe in a higher spirit is to start a business, because there'll be moments where you just go, oh, like, how's this going to turn around? And then something does come along. And then there are moments where it's doing really well and it's a stroke of luck, or it's the right place, the right time. So my thing is, you don't always control your destiny.
Yeah. Like you say, there's a fair amount of soul searching. Everybody has to kind of grapple with who they are. I mean, it's very easy to get distracted, for decades at a time, to get distracted by whatever, by family, by money, it's a very interesting time we're in lots of ways.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think a lot of this stems from having Indian heritage, Belden, because I go into like what is really going on.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I went to India a couple of years ago and I was visiting like a tourist area. It was a temple, and it had something on the wall about the phases of man, and it talked about what we're motivated over time by and what happens to us, and how there's a period of time which is like the wealth accumulation phase, where you're building a family or you're setting up your life. And what I'm noticing in that arc is younger people are breaking what that arc, or what we thought that arc to be. Because younger people at earlier stages are getting access to travel that for many people who are 55 plus, you waited to your retirement to get to. But they're saying, why would I wait? I can do it now. And it's important. I can work there while I'm there. I can do this. I can do that. Younger people have access to cars that you used to have to save up for years to buy, and take it out on a lease and drive around in the best type of vehicle. Younger people are saying, I'd rather stay with my parents in their big home than I would live in a bedsit or a one bed. The rules of the arc have changed, and I think that wealth accumulation is being challenged by young people. And I think that as a force into business is new, because you've got people saying, the good old days, it used to be a lot easier. It's gone too far. And you're like, well, it's gone too far because they can't live by the same rules of what was available to you. The mortgages aren't there, the properties aren't there. So what are people working towards? So I don't know. I can get philosophical about it because I think these things are all quite linked.
One of the things you've touched on a couple of times in this conversation is sort of there's not that much money around. That's sort of true of the UK. That's true of other countries, and even more true in other countries. So it's like relative to where things were, which I think is the point you were making.
Yeah, I should prefix that and say, yes, in the UK is struggling for growth. The business leaders I speak to that have a US presence are actually doing really well. They're saying there is growth in the US, the market's free and it's good to go. There's lots of growth in India, lots of growth in China still. Not at the same percentages as before, but it's still available. So yeah, I should prefix that there's less money in the UK than there was before.
If I could put it this way, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That there's less money?
Well, less growth. And even as you were saying, kind of that breaking the arc of one's life, and at one level, maybe being wiser, younger, maybe not. I don't know. Is it a good thing, or is it a bad thing, or is it's just a thing?
It depends on your school of thought, because if you read, for example, there's a book called Growth by Daniel Zuskind, and what he argues in that book is that we have measured growth against the backdrop of country GDP, and we've done that since 1945. And when we now look back at the opportunity cost of that growth, it came at the cost of mental health, climate, other factors that we weren't measuring. So you look at it now and you say, well, do we want to sacrifice those things in service of growth? And now at its most extreme end, you've got the degrowth movement and you've got people trying to push against this. And then at the other end, you've got free market economics pushing quite hard for it. So to your question of is it good, is it bad? I personally, I don't think it's either. I think it's look at it for what it is and say, well, is this what we want? So for us as a business, we went through the B Corp process, became an accredited B Corp last year, and it did force questions of why would we pick this and not that? Why this and not that? Now, the accreditation scheme itself has come under more scrutiny. It's let companies in that have been deemed to be polluters or deemed to be not for good, but those sorts of things didn't exist 10 or maybe 20 years, well, to the degree that they do now. I don't know, Belden, I don't think it's good or bad, I just think it's opening up the question. My 27-year-old nephew said this to me about AI, and I have to caveat, he works in a tech company, but he just said, we live in the most exciting time. Like, the fact you can prompt this thing to do this thing for you, that's incredible. And I thought, God, yeah, no one's really said that to me. Most people have said this is awful because they're probably a bit older and they're scared.
Well, I guess that's somewhat true of technology in general. Some people think it's fabulous and other people think it's horrible.
Yeah.
It does seem to me that AI thing is notable by its speed.
Yeah, it's not always a responsible conversation though. Like, we've tested it out in our business. We've looked at different processes and how you can embed it. And the bit that I don't find many people talking about in terms of giving you tangible and usable advice is the data protection element of it. So the large companies are talking about their enterprise level schemes and what they can offer you. But back to your question about small businesses, for small businesses grappling with this, you need to protect your data. I don't want to be training a model owned by big tech because some of the data we have is highly sensitive. So it's then, well, what's the click for us? How are we going to find that? That's what I'm currently contending with.
Just kind of connected to that, I think much of the artificial intelligence technology that's been around for 10 years or so, it's kind of been deployed on the side of the big corporations. They're getting to understand, individual behavior better. They can price the right price for you. And very little of it, I think, has been made available to be deployed on the side of individuals as consumers, as citizens, as parents, as, pick your role. It does feel to me like there's an opportunity for somebody there. I just can't figure out, how anyone could do it without getting corrupted.
There's also just so much hype. To your point earlier, it's affected every industry. And so there's no conversation now that from your dentist to your mechanic to your anyone, it's to any radio show. I was listening to the radio yesterday. Someone said, "Oh, maybe we'll all become gardeners and hairdressers and people who work with their hands because they're the jobs that AI cannot take." And well, they are also some of the happiest jobs. So there's a reason why, right? That AI, if it can sweep up some of the dregs of work, all the stuff that's become so monotonous, what could it do for the human mind? But people are slightly addicted to bad work.
Really? So I'm not saying you're wrong, but that's that's a really dark view.
Okay, let me put it another way. When we all learn how to work from home, and we did it unilaterally, knowledge-based working was probably more joyous and was definitely on the side of the employee and not the employer.
Yeah, I'd grant that.
Then the systems came back in that said there are buildings that people need to sit in and therefore you better get back in. And again, maybe I'm talking about the UK, but when I go back on the tube, I look around and go, people look miserable to me. They do not look like they're happy to be here. And if you're spending 45 minutes to 2 hours a day being miserable in service of a job that could be done by a machine, you have to ask the question, what are you pushing for and against?
Sorry, we've wandered well off topic, but I always find this interesting. It does seem to me that a question that I haven't seen many people asking is what's really going on in the companies that are driving people to go back to work? Because if it clearly really was more effective, you think people would be doing it anyway. I think there's some kind of sociological element to it that isn't getting discussed.
Right. I think if I gave you a hypothesis for it, Belden, through the lens of inclusion, I would look at it through two lenses. One is where is the power and where is the money?
Absolutely.
So there is a landlords, it's old money, it's keep it in the system. If you went back to first principles, you'd redesign what the building is for. You'd think about the future of cities.
Mm-hmm.
You'd recreate the structure because the 9 to 5 and going together to create widgets was a industrial revolution, Henry Ford model, which you don't need now. The second thing is I think a lot of it comes down to how people lead and how people like to lead. So around the time where the conversation was very loud about this, I particularly noticed a gender divide or a childcare responsibility divide where you would say, well, actually, if you can free me up for an extra hour a day so I can fit my caring responsibilities in and be productive at work, that would be great. But that's gotten lost. And I think that's where people are saying, well, how do you make this really work? Because people don't become parents and lose their productivity. They, if anything, get more productive because they've become more...
They have to.
Yeah. So I think some of these are just about old paradigm models of leadership and then the new potential that sits out there.
So what do you see ahead on this Gartner curve? Do you think we're going to start to see people, organizations, business leaders seeing this actually does make a difference? You can see it in the numbers,
I think there's three things that I'm looking at very carefully tied to your P&L and your balance sheet. So the first is the top line to say, am I getting more? And the only way I think you can get more is you sell the same thing to more people, a different thing to the same people, or different things to different people. Those are probably your three routes to making more money. So it's how are you doing that? Then there's your staff cost line, if you're a people-based business, to say, how do I make more of that by engagement, challenging retention, probably tackling that against AI adoption and longer-term shifts, those two lines. And then the third is reputation, to say, actually, what is happening to my intangible asset of reputation? And if I'm changing something, does that impact that there? So what we're noticing, particularly in the US, is the companies that rode back, because Belden, there were three types of approaches. There were the retreaters to this, there were the reframers, and then there's the reformers. And the ones who retreated, I think they're now seeing a backlash to that, to say, gosh, you were very quick to do that.
Yeah, you probably never really bought into this at all anyway.
No. And you have that on a consumer level, and then on a shareholder level, you have the lawsuits playing out where shareholders are saying, well, let us govern the business how we want to govern it. And you've got a little bit of incubation and protection there. But you can't negate the political element of this. You cannot negate the way this is being pushed. So I don't want to paint like a super rosy picture and it's all people power. A lot of it is legislation. But I do get the sense that there'll be a swing, because there always is after however many years.
Sort of looking at the history of models of business and models of strategy as they've evolved over time. One of the things I think was true, maybe even up until the 60s, maybe even a little bit longer, depends on where in the world and what industry, is that organizations, particularly large businesses, felt a sense of responsibility, shared responsibility for the overall fabric, for the robustness of institutions, for the educational system. That just seems like that's lost. At one level you go, well, isn't the government supposed to do that? Well, maybe, but they're, around the world in lots of places rowing back from all sorts of things. And citizens don't yet seem really to have somehow been able to organize quite in the same way. I don't know quite what that means, but it feels like there's something there.
Yeah. What's sitting with me hearing you speak, Belden, the two words that come to my mind are connection and community.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
And I think what business or a workplace used to be was somewhere you would connect and somewhere you would build a community. And it strikes me that particularly in office-based work, that is on the decline. Whereas potentially in more blue-collar factory type work, there still is sense of community. There's probably less agency, but still community and connection, because people are in the physical space together. And I wonder if some of that is down to the way that we're working. Now, you might argue, well, get people back into the office 5 days a week and they will have a community and they will connect. The trade-off, I think, that happens with that is then their connection community to their home life and their family life. Something has to give. So it's, can you have both? Can both peacefully coexist at the same time? I don't know. I think we're working that out.
Yeah. Anything we haven't covered you'd like listeners to know, either about the Unmistakables, about yourself, or about this whole world of inclusion? And
I would say if you're listening and you are a smaller business, if you go on to our website, which is theunmistakables.com, and then under the About Us section called Inside Out Inclusion, you can actually take an assessment for your own business of how inclusive you are, and then look at where the gaps might be. So I would just say have a look at that if you're looking for something. And then at the bottom of the site you can sign up to our newsletter where we put out news about inclusion, and a lot of people say they really enjoy reading it, so maybe your followers will as well.
That's really good. That's brilliant. We'll get those into the show notes too.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Really glad to have had a chance to catch up with where you are, to get your perspectives on the world we're in right now. Officially here, for the record, I'm going to wish you well.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And look forward to catching up at some point to hear kind of what the next chapters hold. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.